This webinar and again, this is a webinar, so we're basically, it's sort of a bit of a, at least for most of it, a one-way discussion. So I'm going to be walking through the modalities, the new modalities for describing and modifying ecologically or biologically significant marine areas, or EBSAs. Of course, I'll give a little bit of background for those discussions and also highlight some key, not only the actual aspects and steps of the modalities themselves, but also the some key considerations and key aspects to keep in mind. As this is a webinar, it's not meant to be a big open discussion with lots of people jumping in and speaking, as much as we wish we had the time for that. But we will have some time at the end for questions. I believe we do have a question function. So you can, write questions in there at any time, really. And at the end, we will see how many of them we'll be able to address. So, and apologies for rudely not introducing myself. My name is Joe Appiat. I coordinate the work on marine, coastal, and island biodiversity here at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD Secretariat. I'm joined by my colleagues Jackie Grekin and Johanny Martinez, who are also part of the Marine and Islands team here. And we've put together this webinar to provide a bit of explanation of the modalities for the new modalities for the EBSA process. These do entail changes to how we will be describing and modifying, well, how we will describing EBSAs, and actually having a process to modify EBSAs, which we really haven't had before. These are a bit more complicated than the previous elements of the process, so we felt it's important to do a little bit of awareness raising and sensitization about these modalities and about how to actually use them. So for those of you that are EBSA nerds and longtime EBSA fans, you can probably shut off for the next few minutes, because basically I have to give a little bit of background for those that are coming brand new into this. But that's what I'll do now. So EBSAs stands for ecologically or biologically significant marine areas. This has been a critically important area of work under the convention for a very long time. Really, the process, the process to describe EBSAs through the CBD began in 2011, really. So it's, as you can tell, also quite a long area of our, quite a long-running area of work of ours. Really, this work came about actually, in the lead up to the adoption of the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were the Aichi targets were the precursors to the current global biodiversity framework, and the Aichi targets were adopted in 2010. At the time, of course, they were looking at different targets for biodiversity, including things like area-based conservation and other types of targets. And they were thinking, many parties were thinking, if we're going to have to make our efforts to achieve these global goals and targets, where do we focus our attention and efforts? Where do we actually need to really focus our attention, and where are the areas of comparatively higher ecological and biological significance in the ocean and marine and coastal areas? Now, this is what led to the adoption of the EBSA criteria at COP9 in 2008. These are a set of 7 criteria that address different facets of ecological and biological significance. And the initial intention was that this criteria would be taken up and applied by parties and competent authorities in their own, under their own mandates and jurisdictions to describe areas of ecological and biological significance. The criteria themselves are quite broad, as you can tell. They can be applied to probably any different type of biome or habitat or ecosystem. And there were also no thresholds adopted as part of that criteria. And again, this is something that's deliberate. It was meant to be flexible and able to be applied in different places in the context of different types of data richness, knowledge levels, different types of knowledge. So this was an important step in the process. But when we arrived to the next COP, it was clear that parties needed not only a little bit of help, but they needed some consistency in terms of how the EBSA criteria should be applied and how the outcomes of that work should be recognized by the CBD community. So this led to the mandate from the COP to the Secretariat in 2010 to begin a process of describing EBSAs through regional workshops. Now, for the entirety of the history of the EBSA process, these workshops were really the main and primarily only mechanism through which EBSAs were described. And as you can see from the map there, that's the map of the scope of EBSA workshops. Those are not EBSAs, those are the scopes of the different workshops that are held on a regional basis. And these were intended to synthesize best available scientific information, and with experts present at the meeting, both from parties and from other governments, of course, and from relevant scientific organizations, NGOs. In some cases, we had representatives from indigenous peoples and local communities to interpret that data, interpret the information that we had, put it all together, and work with one of our contracted geospatial mapping teams to see which areas in these regions meet the EBSA criteria and to map these areas out. The outcomes of those workshops then went for consideration of SBSTA and COP. And if they made it through SBSTA and COP, they basically became CBD EBSAs and they were sent to the EBSA repository. This process was meant to be very data rich, very much based on the best available data that we had at the time of the workshops. The geospatial mapping teams that we had contracted for these, and for all those workshops, we worked with either Duke University Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab or a team from CSIRO Australia. And they worked in most cases for months in advance of the workshop to compile as much geospatial information as they could to make it available for the workshop. But importantly, the process was also very much driven by expert interpretation. It's one thing to look at data, to look at maps, and to feel that it's important, or it seems to look important, but to actually know how these different types of features and data relate to each other, and also to see where there might be some gaps. Or where things might be available, different types of knowledge that is not available in databases or published journals, but actually coming from other types of knowledge sources. This is where the expert interpretation aspect of the CBD process was critically important. So, as I said before, the previous process basically, when we look at it now, it's incredible how simple it is, because our new process is much more complicated. But basically, a CBD workshop would be held that would be in many cases prompted either by interest from a given region to have a workshop there, and then later, of course, later in the process to start to fill in the gaps of where we haven't had regional workshops yet. The outcomes of those workshops and the outcomes of the workshops had to be basically agreed by all participants at the workshop. So it's very much a peer review process at the workshop itself. The outcomes of those, which were areas proposed as meeting the EBSA criteria, went to SBSTA, when SBSTA is our scientific body under the CBD, and then to the COP. And if they made it through the COP, they basically became EBSAs and were transmitted all around the world, including to the General Assembly and to parties, and also included in the EBSA repository. So one of the things that has remained the same, and I'll get to this later, is the only thing that will go in the EBSA repository are things that have been considered by SBSTA and COP, and that was a critical part of the negotiations. Another key aspect of the process is that an important caveat that we have to remember is that the application of the EBSA criteria is a scientific and technical exercise, that areas meeting the criteria may require enhanced conservation and management measures, and that this can be achieved through a variety of means, including but not limited to marine protected areas and impact assessments. But importantly, the decision about what should or shouldn't be done, what types of management measures may or may not be needed, those decisions are up to states and competent intergovernmental organizations. The designation of something as an EBSA does not imply, or does not state that it needs to be a protected area, that some activity can or can't take place there. It is basically just a scientific description of the significance, ecological and biological significance of that area. Now, obviously, that's a critical piece of information to make those decisions, but the EBSA process itself is not the process that makes those decisions. Those decisions are made by states and competent intergovernmental organizations. If you want a little bit of easy to digest history of the EBSA process and its impacts, have a look at the EBSA, what we call the EBSA impact study. It's available on our website. We published this, I believe, in 2022. It's a little bit old by now, but since we haven't had any EBSA workshops since then, it's not so out of date. But it highlights the contributions of the EBSA process, not only in terms of describing EBSAs, but also all the co-benefits, including providing a foundation for supporting integrated ocean planning, spurring national and regional management and capacity building and scientific collaboration, stimulating a multifaceted dialogue among different processes, and showing how this information and the approaches have been utilized in different global and regional process. And I think overall, one thing that we can really be proud of in the EBSA process, and I say we, not only for the Secretariat, but all the parties and experts involved, is that it is the only intergovernmental process to date that does look at identifying and mapping areas for their inherent ecological and biological values. Now, we know, of course, that FAO and RFMOs have their process for vulnerable marine ecosystems. IMO has particularly sensitive sea areas. ISA has the areas of particular environmental interest. Those are all very, very important and actually quite similar to the EBSA process. But one of the key differences is that all of those other processes generally look at areas with respect to certain types of pressures and activities to directly inform specific types of management measures. That's important, of course, but the EBSA process is different in that it takes away that management element so that we can look more broadly without, let's say, in some cases, being tainted by what type of measure needs to take place there or what types of activities can or can't take place there. So basically what we have to remember is that EBSA descriptions provide scientific information about the ecological and biological features of specific areas. They don't prescribe management measures, and they don't say what should or shouldn't take place there. Those decisions are up to states and competent organizations. But the information is definitely meant to be used to make those decisions. What's also important is that the EBSA process and EBSA work doesn't imply the expression of a position on legal status of any country, city, territory, or area, including maritime zones, concerning the delimitation of maritime boundaries, and it doesn't have economic or legal implications. And that, EBSAs themselves should not be relied on as a basis for asserting or denying claims to sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdictions, or any relating to any disputes. So really, we need to keep in mind that the EBSAs are scientific. It's a scientific process. Inevitably, when you put shapes on a map, things come to mind in different ways, whether it's, as I said, management measures or jurisdictional issues. But in essence, the process is not meant to and should not deal with those things and does not deal with those things. So some years ago, there was, when we were starting to come to the, I don't want to say the end of the first round, but in essence, sort of in that respect, having almost started to fill in all of the gaps in the regional workshop scopes, it became clear that maybe there were some things that we needed to change in the EBSA process. Maybe we needed to consider how we were describing EBSAs and who was at the workshops, for example, how to take in outcomes from national processes, how to modify EBSAs, and these discussions kind of emerged in a somewhat organic way over the years of the EBSA process. So one was modifying EBSAs. Really, the EBSA process is focused on describing EBSAs, and we haven't to date modified any EBSAs through the EBSA process. But of course, to be scientific, you need to be able to update information. New research and data becomes available all the time about features described as EBSAs. And these can, in some cases, affect the shape of the area or the ranking of the area against the EBSA criteria. We also know there's cases where certain countries or regions have actually taken the outcomes of the workshop in their given country or region and further improved it and want to have that information be, factored back into the CBD EBSA description. We also, of course, have errors that happens from time to time, or incorrect information was used to describe an EBSA. Some cases that information has changed. The databases are always being updated, or features described as an EBSA may have shifted or changed location. And we know with respect to to pelagic features, for example, climate change is driving changes like that all the time. We also, in some cases, have simple mistakes in EBSA descriptions. It could be even editorial errors, for example, but we haven't had a process or real clear mechanism to modify EBSAs. And then describing EBSAs. Workshops had really been the only mechanism by which EBSAs have been described. And those workshops have covered nearly all regions. So they haven't covered all regions. And even for the regions that they have covered, we can't earnestly say that every single aspect of every part of that region was fully considered in the workshop. The workshops were limited by not only the data we had available, but also the people and the experts and the expertise that we had available at the time. And we do know that there were, as I said, that there were gaps in the areas and features covered by workshops. As well, some national jurisdictions, some states opted not to include their national jurisdictions in the consideration of the workshop for various reasons. In some cases, they had an ongoing process. In other cases, they just didn't have the ability to participate in the workshop for whatever reason. We also know that different countries are conducting their own EBSA or EBSA-like processes that have not been included in regional workshops, and that other intergovernmental processes are conducting complementary exercises that also generate important information, in many cases on areas that are also described as EBSAs. So there was a clear rationale to incorporate the outputs from national processes and other processes, and also over time we had seen many of the some of the concerns and some of the speed bumps we were facing were also related to sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction. As much as we tried to keep those issues away from the EBSA process, they inevitably, in some cases, were dealt with in certain ways or had to be dealt with in certain ways. So how to deal with this was also a key area of discussion over many years of the process. So as I said, these issues have been addressed in slightly different forms. So, we've often said that these issues have been we've been negotiating the new EBSA modalities for 8 years. In some cases, yes, in other cases, no, because we didn't exactly talk about it in the same form as we always did. They kind of evolved organically because we saw the need to sort of improve how we're actually describing EBSAs and keep them up to date and improve our scientific approaches. And also, these discussions have evolved through 4 global expert workshops. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the CBD world, basically expert workshops tend to be a common mechanism by which the decisions of the recommendations of SUBSTA and COP decisions are informed and provide the basis for those discussions. So the modalities that we ended up with really reflect the long history of those discussions on the issue and have been crafted with careful consideration of the views and positions expressed by parties over time. We were hoping to make good progress on this at COP15, but we didn't have time because COP15 was adopting and negotiating the global biodiversity framework. So this led to a request from COP15 to convene technical and legal expert workshops, which were held in 2023. And the outcomes of those workshops went to SUBSTA 26 and then eventually to COP16. So we had, arriving at COP16, we actually had general optimism at the start of COP16 on this issue because significant progress was made on this at SUBSTA 26. Parties were very happy with the outcomes of the workshop generally, of the workshops. And of course, we had still some key issues to resolve, but it was a pretty big step forward overall for the negotiations. Of course, we still had intense contact group discussions and lots of discussions in the hallways, but in the end, we had new modalities for the EBSA process adopted. You can see there was a lot of jubilance there. People cheering, jumping up, some people crying. It was a big moment, especially for the marine people of the CBD. And this is a major achievement for not only for the EBSA work, but actually was one of the most important outcomes of COP16. And of course, as we know, it comes at a critically important time in light of the upcoming meetings on the BBNJ agreement. Now, I'm going to go through the modalities themselves. I will occasionally have to look down at the actual steps so I don't mess them up and say anything wrong. So apologies if you catch me looking down at my phone, which I'm doing now. I just want to make sure I'm doing my job correctly. So again, the previous EBSA process, very simple, very easy when we look at it now. Workshops, then workshops onto SUBSTA and COP. Actually, submissions, the draft descriptions, in some cases were provided to the workshop. In other cases were developed at the workshops, but the workshops are really where it all came together. Now things are a little bit different. So first, I'm going to go through the steps of the process for basically 3 pathways. Then I'm going to talk about some other aspects of the process itself that are centrally relevant. So first, we'll start with the steps, and we'll first look at the description of new EBSAs or the modification of existing EBSAs within national jurisdiction to be included in the repository. So one thing I wanted to highlight is that the modalities for description and modification are the same. They're the same process. The only thing that differs is whether where these submissions are focused on, whether it's in areas within national jurisdiction or areas beyond national jurisdiction, and whether they're going to go to the repository or the information sharing mechanism. And for the first case we're looking at is national jurisdiction going to the repository. So we start with a proponent, and I'll get to proponents later, but the proponent sends the submission to the Secretariat, and the submission has to use the EBSA template, has to include geographic coordinates, has to include information on the process by which the submission was developed, including any consultation with indigenous peoples and local communities. There's the optional step of asking the CBD if it can issue a notification about its intent to provide a submission, as well as possibly an optional step to be for submissions to be developed at an EBSA workshop, but this is depending on a number of other factors. But the required step is that the proponent sends the submission to the Secretariat. Secretariat adds a record of the submission as it was received to the information sharing mechanism so everybody can see it, and issues a notification on the submission and invites comments, scientific comments, basically comments to help improve the quality of the submission if that's needed, and it keeps that open for 6 months. After that, the proponent has 3 options. It can address the comments and proceed further in the process. It not address the comments and not proceed further in the process. Or request the Secretary to completely remove the submission from the information sharing mechanism. There also is the option, if conditions allow, and if there's a workshop, the relevant workshop taking place, to have this submission discussed at an EBSA workshop. But again, this is optional. But in either case, either the submission after step 3 or going through the workshop goes to SBSTA for consideration. If it goes through SBSTA, it gets to COP for consideration, and if COP agrees, it goes to the EBSA repository and then becomes basically an EBSA. So here, as you see, going to the repository means that it has to go through consideration of SBSTA and COP. The other case that we have here is national jurisdiction areas, submissions within national jurisdiction that are going to the information sharing mechanism. Now, this is a different mechanism that doesn't require consideration by SBSTA and COP. It's mainly meant to share information on a process that a country has taken. So it's a bit different. It doesn't have as much of the sort of CBD stamp of approval, so to speak, because it hasn't been considered by SBSTA and COP. But it was very important for many parties to have these 2 options, to either want to have that recognition and that sort of CBD stamp and go to the repository, or just to be able to share their information and have that information recognized by the global community. So in the case of national jurisdiction submissions, there also is similarly the option to have a notification or potentially work on this at a workshop, even before it comes to the submission stage. But the submission comes as provided by the proponent to the Secretariat. It doesn't have to use the EBSA template, but it's strongly recommended. But it does have to include geographical coordinates and a map, a description of how it meets the EBSA criteria, and information on how it was developed. Then it comes to the CBD. Now, the CBD then makes the submission available for parties and governments only. So basically, we, as opposed to having a peer review process and making it open for comments, here, with respect to areas going to or submissions going to the information sharing mechanism, the intention the step here is to make it available only for parties and other governments, not for comment, but to allow time for parties and other governments to flag any political or legal concerns they see with this submission, and to utilize a mechanism for dealing with concerns related to sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdiction. But this is not a comment period. Then the submission is included in the information sharing mechanism after 5 months, and that 5 months is giving it time for any legal or political issues to be flagged. Now, if the proponent wants to invite comments, and to help improve the status of their area, they can. But if they do that, they can choose to either maintain the submission as it is after receiving comments, to revise the submission, or to ask the submission to be removed. But in any case, this doesn't have to go through SBSTA and COP. It's really up to the proponent whether they want to keep it in the information sharing mechanism. Now, finally, we come to description of EBSAs or modification of EBSAs in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now, in this case, the only option is to go to the EBSA repository, which makes sense, of course, and more of the steps are required. So similar to the other cases, the proponent has the option to ask for a notification about its intent to develop a submission before it sends a submission. Frankly, I mean, we hope to avoid a lot of unnecessary and superfluous notifications to avoid overwhelming our focal points, but that nonetheless is an option in the process. But the proponent has to use the EBSA template, include the coordinates, include information on how it was developed, and send it to the Secretariat, after which it's included, a record of the submission is included in the information sharing mechanism. Then we have the process to invite comments for 6 months, and the comments that are received and the submission itself are sent to an EBSA workshop. So the comments, the open comment period and the workshop are mandatory steps of this process. The outcomes of the workshop then go to SBSTA and COP for consideration, and if it makes it through there, they go through the EBSA repository. Now, I know this is a lot to go through, but we actually published recently a handbook that has all of these charts available, so I encourage you to read the handbook and look at the charts. But one thing I wanted to highlight is that there are some common elements of the different pathways, and this is a really important part. We don't have all like 6 different sets of elements for these 3 processes. Basically, they're different variations of whether they're required or optional for all of them. So when we look at areas within national jurisdiction, submissions within national jurisdiction for inclusion in the repository, the template it's required to use the template and required to have all the other information that we talked about, the geographic coordinates and the information on how it was developed. It has to go through a peer review period, an open comment period. It's optional to go through a workshop, but it has to be considered by SBSTA and COP. Conversely, for submissions within national jurisdiction going to the information sharing mechanism, the template is not required, but it's strongly encouraged. The peer review period is optional, remember, but there is a requirement for us to make it available for parties and other governments to see, to potentially flag any political or legal concerns if they have some. It won't go to a regional workshop, and it does not have to be considered by SBSTA and COP. Now, finally, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, we have really the most stringent requirements, which of course makes sense. So the EBSA template is required, the peer review period is required, the workshop is required, and it has to be considered by SBSTA and COP. So you see different variations of the same elements across all of these 3 processes. We also have a process now to correct editorial errors. So, we put these descriptions together under great duress and very late nights in some cases in these workshops. So we make mistakes. But for this is a bit of a streamlined process to deal with editorial errors. So if a state informs the Secretariat of an editorial error, first the state would have to inform the Secretariat of the editorial error. And the state within whose jurisdiction the correction is proposed has to be either the one informing us, or they have to be alerted to this, of course, and be okay with this. The Secretariat then issues a notification to provide information on the editorial error and the requested correction. We would then implement the editorial correction 3 months after the issuance of the notification. And then we would add a footnote to the corrected description to indicate that an editorial correction was made. And then, of course, we would make a report on the corrections just for the information of SBSTA and COP, so they're aware of this. So then coming to proponents, who can provide a submission? Basically, first, only states can provide a submission. Now, states are definitely encouraged to work with anyone they want, including civil society and other stakeholders in developing their submissions. But in order for us to actually be able to receive it, it has to come from a CBD national focal point. Now, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, if it's coming, it can come from any state individually or collectively. It can be one state, it can be a group of states, and it can also come through competent intergovernmental organizations. So, basically, intergovernmental organizations are a collection of states, so they can submit a modification or a description on behalf of and with the approval of their parties and member states in areas beyond national jurisdiction. In areas within national jurisdiction, only the state within whose jurisdiction the modification or description is proposed can be the proponent on a submission. For any submission that includes areas within national jurisdiction, the state that has jurisdiction over that area where it's located must consent to and be involved in the submission. Otherwise, we cannot receive it. And this is exactly why all submissions have to come with geographic coordinates and a map. This also includes submissions that only partially include areas within national jurisdiction. So we will not, the Secretariat is not permitted to accept any submission regarding a submission or modification, a description or modification that is wholly or partially within jurisdiction that does not include as a proponent the state that has jurisdiction over that area. All of these submissions must include a map and geographic coordinates, but of course, states can and should collaborate with other stakeholders in developing the submission and putting it forward. Now, some other aspects of how we can make these submissions strong. So I think a big part of the negotiations was seeing what we really need and what are the clear rules from sort of a legal standpoint, but then how do we also can't forget about how we make the submissions good and strong, having a strong scientific basis. So looking at some of the considerations that were highlighted in the COP decision is ways to strengthen the quality of the submissions as well as avoid potential concerns coming up in the process. Proponents should consider a few key things. The first is collaborating with competent intergovernmental organizations and other relevant organizations and experts, as well as indigenous peoples and local communities in developing these submissions. So, the state doesn't have to have somebody off in a corner office somewhere coming up with a submission on their own. Ideally, it should be a collaborative process and an inclusive and transparent process to develop submissions. It's important to avoid developing submissions that may raise concerns about sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdictions. There is a mechanism in the process to deal with that, but ideally we wouldn't want to have to utilize that mechanism. It's good if these things are taken into consideration at the outset before they come to the Secretariat. The importance of having a strong scientific basis with sufficient information and transparency, and the need to consider regional dimensions of marine and coastal ecosystems, including regional differences in data availability, as well as collaboration across regions. So then also one thing that was discussed quite a bit is what do we mean by modification and what would be reasons for modification? And these are all things that are spelled out in the COP decision. So first, the modification of an EBSA description may include changes such as changes to the textual description of the area, changes to how it ranks against the EBSA criteria, a change in the shape, location, depth, or size of the area, or basically removing the description from the repository of the information sharing mechanism and moving it to the respective archive. So that is an option. There can be cases in which areas don't meet the EBSA criteria anymore, or other reasons that, and within national jurisdiction, a country may wish to do this. So this was another area of discussion, the reasons for modification. So for areas beyond national jurisdictions, modifications may be proposed for any of the following reasons. There's newly available or accessible knowledge or information, including traditional knowledge, innovations and practices of indigenous peoples and local communities associated with the area. There may be a change in the ecological or biological features of the area, or there may have been scientific errors identified in the descriptions. For areas within national jurisdiction, modifications may be proposed preferably for the same reasons that are listed above, and possibly for any other reason deemed valid by the state within whose jurisdiction the modification is proposed. But what is important is that regardless of the reason, the reason has to be indicated in the submission. It has to be clear in the submission why it's proposed to be modified. Now, then there is this mechanism for objections to submissions due to the existence of a claim or dispute related to sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdiction. Now, this is very long because I'm very hesitant to paraphrase a legal text, but you will see first at the top that caveat, that disclaimer, that EBSAs, again, have to remember, don't apply the expression of opinion concerning the legal status of any given country, or and should not be relied on as a basis for asserting or denying claims to sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdictions. But of course, we know that some submissions can cause concerns relating to sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdictions. There are different ways in which such concerns can and probably should be addressed through the modalities. First is that this is the reason that submissions have to include a map and geographic coordinates. As we discussed earlier, proponents should avoid developing submissions to cases that may raise such concerns. And there's also the option, of course, if an issue is if a issue does cause concern from a state for a submission that was received, the state can directly reach out to another state, and you find a bilateral resolution, and the proponent could ask the Secretariat to amend or withdraw the submission. However, if this isn't possible for whatever reason, there is a mechanism that the COP 16 agreed to a mechanism for objections to submissions for the existence of a claim or dispute related to sovereignty or sovereign rights or jurisdiction. And basically, this would function as follows. At any time, if a submission is made, it's known so we alert everyone that we've received a submission for all of the pathways. This is something we have to do. If this causes concern for a state with respect to these issues, that state can formally communicate, and the state, meaning the national focal point, can formally communicate to the executive secretary an objection to the inclusion of this submission in the repository of the information sharing mechanism, and they have to, of course, say why. In this case, the submission will not be advanced any further and will not be included in the repository information sharing mechanism until a withdrawal of the objection is communicated to us by the objecting state. And a record of the fact that a submission was received and objected to would be included in the information sharing mechanism, regardless of whether the objection was withdrawn or not. So basically, this gives a mechanism for states to say, look, this area, it's touching on things that we have different views about with another state about disputed waters or sovereignty or sovereign rights. So we'd like to flag this, and we'd like to have this not move forward. Basically, the process stops there, and we wait until we hear anything from the objecting state, and hopefully things can be resolved bilaterally, but that doesn't involve the Secretariat or the CBD process. Now, then we're looking at workshops and their role in the process. So workshops, as we've seen before, have always had a very important role in the process, have been the foundation and the basis for how we've described EBSAs in the past, and they still will have important roles. The outcomes so first, workshops have to be regional still. That was something that was outlined in the COP decision. The outcomes of those still have to go to SBSTA and COP, and they're meant to be organized with advice from the informal advisory group and in consultation with the Bureau. The geographic focus, scope, and location of the workshops will be selected on the basis of a number of factors, including the locations and areas of focus of the submissions, as well as the availability of resources. Participants in the workshops will be selected on the basis of their expertise, and obviously ensuring broad and inclusive participation that is not limited to representatives of the coastal states only. So in the past, CBD regional workshops were limited in terms of nominations from states and relevant organizations. They were limited to the participation was limited to experts from the region, from the coastal states. Now, given that these workshops will probably focus much more so, and primarily in some cases, on areas beyond national jurisdiction, this of course doesn't make sense. ABNJ is the interest of all parties and all of the global community. So this nominations will be open to the entire world, basically, for these workshops. But of course, we have to select from among these. We can't have a workshop of 300 people. We need to have something that's manageable. So we'll have to select from among those nominations. Submissions for areas beyond national jurisdiction have to go through a workshop. SBSTA and COP cannot consider ABNJ submissions unless they've gone through a workshop. Submissions for areas within national jurisdiction going to the repository have the option of going to a workshop. And the proponent, of course, can decide that, but this, of course, depends on where and when a workshop is going to be held. If time and resources permit, draft submissions that are perhaps not ready yet to be submitted to the Secretariat may also be discussed at the workshop. But of course, workshops have limited time, so we don't want to spend too much time on that. So we got to focus on the things that are actually on the table. So finally, the COP outlined a clear delineation between the EBSA repository and the EBSA information sharing mechanism. As you've seen in previous slides, all of these different pathways have used these two places, the repository and the information sharing mechanism, as respective endpoints. So the repository will still contain and will still be the place that all submissions that have been considered by Substa and COP will go. There will also be an archive of previous versions of the EBSA descriptions in cases where they've been modified. But then the EBSA information sharing mechanism will contain, of course, not only the submissions that have taken that pathway and an archive of previous versions in cases where those areas were modified, but all the other information that basically we need to know: records of the submissions, reports, CBD EBSA workshop reports. Guidance related to the application of the EBSA criteria, all things of this nature. And actually, we're currently in the process right now and hope to be launching either this week or next week the reformulated version of the EBSA website. So it will look somewhat similar, but it will have a clear delineation. As you see in the top left, it will have a clear delineation of the repository and the information sharing mechanism. So when you actually come to the landing page, you have to pick which one you want to go to. You want to go to the repository, or you want to go to the information sharing mechanism. And maps for those different places and for areas that have gone to either the repository or the information sharing mechanism. And this will also be a place where we will keep everyone abridged of the status of different submissions. So what are the areas, who proposed them, when were they submitted, and where are they in the process of all the steps they have to go through. This is not currently live yet. So if you go to the EBSA website, you'll see the old version, but we hope to be posting this. It's basically ready to go. We hope to be posting it perhaps tomorrow, but maybe next week. The COP also extended the term of the informal advisory group and basically gave it some important roles in these modalities. This is to advise the Secretariat on the possible and basically advise the Secretariat in the planning of these EBSA workshops. And what that means for us is looking at the possible scope of where EBSA workshops could be held, primarily on the basis of submissions received. This would include, as we see, a consideration of factors such as the size and number of submissions received, and also things, for example, such as the time that how long it's been since a workshop has been previously held in that region. So, for example, the most recent EBSA workshop was held in 2019 in the Northeast Atlantic, but the first EBSA workshop was held in 2011 in the South Pacific. So you can see probably quite a lot of differences in terms of need to go and update that information across those two regions. Once a workshop scope and location are selected, to advise on the types of information that should be compiled and made available at the workshop and what kinds of expertise the workshop would benefit from having there. Also, just to flag that the current term of the IAG members finishes this year in June, and we will soon be posting a notification to invite nominations for the next term of the IAG, which will start in July. So we're currently finishing up the current term of the IAG, and we'll be soon posting a notification to invite nominations for the next term. Now, another thing we wanted to highlight are the timelines for the different pathways of the modalities. In many cases, this can take quite a lot of time to go through all steps in the process. So there is the 6-month comment period on submissions, and submissions going to the repository have to be open for comments. There's the time for an EBSA workshop to be convened. Of course, this takes time and money. And submissions and ABNJ have to be discussed at a workshop before going to Substa or COP. Now, if you look at those two things together, that means ABNJ submissions have to go through a 6-month. We have to receive them in the Secretariat. Then they have to go through a 6-month comment period. Then they have to go through a workshop before they can go to Substa. So that when you work backwards from a Substa, you actually have quite limited amount of time from now to the next to Substa 28 for this work to get done. And then finally, preparation and posting of pre-session documents. So it's not enough to have all this done just before Substa. They have to be done far enough in advance of Substa for us in the Secretariat to abide by the document rules, to be able to put these in the documentation for Substa. And these have to be available in all languages 6 weeks prior to Substa. Before doing this, all this has to go through internal review and editing prior to posting. So really, we would have had to complete all of these steps, including the workshop, at least 3 months in advance of a Substa meeting. So it's quite long time frames for some of these pathways. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the Secretariat to operationalize these modalities. We published a handbook, and most of what I'm showing you here is from that handbook. That is available online on the EBSA webpage. It's also shown and it's linked in the notification that we posted, I think, a few weeks ago. And this handbook does not replace the COP decision. The COP decision is the agreed language. The handbook is meant to just explain it a little bit more, hopefully in an easy to digest way, but it does not replace the language of the COP decision, and it does not have any formal status under the convention. We're having this webinar, of course. We've published the notification to announce our readiness to receive submissions, and just a reminder that submissions can be received at any time. They don't have to be sent to us in response to a notification. They can come at any time. As I noted, we're making structural and functional modifications to the EBSA website. And finally, fundraising for EBSA modalities. So here, most of this work can be done with our internal staff resources, but the workshops cost money. They cost quite a bit of money. And at the moment, we don't have sufficient funds to convene the next EBSA workshop. And this is something that's a bit concerning from the Secretariat side. We're still missing the full amount of funds we need to have the next EBSA workshop. And if we don't have an EBSA workshop before SBSTA 28, that means that SBSTA 28 and COP 17 will not be able to consider any ABNJ submissions. So please, if there's any parties on the line following, please work through your networks and see if there's anything you can do to help us get some funds, help meet this funding gap to have the EBSA workshop, the next EBSA workshop. So to wrap up, we can look at what's changed. We have a more elaborated process and new mechanisms for peer review. We have a mechanism to modify EBSAs and to include national EBSAs in the IS and the information sharing mechanism. Submissions now have to come from states and only states. We have new mechanisms and approaches to avoid these political issues. Submissions, another difference is that submissions have to be made before workshops, and workshops can only consider submissions because any submission would have had to go through a step before it gets to the workshop. So we won't have this process of organically developing submissions at workshops as we've done in the past. Finally, workshops will not be limited to coastal states only. Now, what has remained is that we're still based on the EBSA criteria and using the EBSA template, which is required for submissions going to the repository, still have an important role for the EBSA workshops, and anything going to the repository still has to go through SBSTA and COP consideration. So, a lot of talking for me. I'm happy to stop talking, or at least invite some comments and questions, mainly questions, hopefully. But I hope this was informative, and I'm going to look and see if there's any questions right now in the Q&A. Give me 1 second. Hold. Okay, this is a bit of a new mechanism for looking at questions. Let's see. Okay, so one question is, and apologies, there's a whole lot of questions here. We probably won't have time to get through them all. But one is, what would the process be when the EBSA is located beyond 2 or more national jurisdictions? This is a very logical case. Actually, we have many EBSAs that are exactly like this, that do span across multiple national jurisdictions. The process would be the same in terms of the steps that have to be taken. But basically, every jurisdiction that submission touches, that state has to be involved. So hypothetically, let's just say hypothetically, we have 2 countries. There's a coral reef patch that spans across their 2 jurisdictions. Both of them say, you know, this area is important. We want to put it forward as an EBSA, or you know, we want to go ahead with this and describe it as an EBSA. They have to follow the steps of the process. You know, of course, whether it's the repository, the information sharing mechanism, and there's different steps, but both of those countries have to approve. If one country says we want to do this, the other country says no, we don't want to do that, then that country can describe only deal with things up to the limit of their jurisdiction. So basically, when you have things that span jurisdictions, it has to deal with it has to include anything. Basically, it has to have formally signed on to the submission, the country within the state within whose jurisdiction that submission touches at all. If it's two jurisdictions, both of those countries have to be involved. If it's five, all of those countries have to be involved. Otherwise, the submission can't deal with those. Then we have another question. So a question from our friend Danny, who should know the answer to this. You were the workshop co-chair, Danny, but I'm just kidding. Danny, a very good friend and helpful colleague. She's asking, if we're talking about areas beyond national jurisdiction, can an intergovernmental organization secretariat mandated by their members submit a proposal directly to the CBD, or does it need to go through all the respective national focal points? So it can, an intergovernmental organization can provide a submission with the approval of their states. That is what is spelled out in the COP decision. So then we have another question. So actually, there's not so many. So if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to drop them in while I look at what we have here. How will traditional and indigenous knowledge be incorporated into the workshop for EBSAs? How will traditional tales and songs, for example, be treated? So it's very clear from the COP decision. It's always been a clear part of our process that workshops will involve experts that have knowledge in the area and the features that we're dealing with and in the regions that we're looking at, of course. And that can include and has included in the past representatives and experts from indigenous peoples and local communities. For example, we've had experts in the past participating in workshops from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, from the Sami communities. So that's definitely been a practice that's been held. How will this type of knowledge be treated? Well, if it's knowledge that's brought forth and information that's brought forth by the participants at the workshop, and they have the right to do that, it will be included and can be treated as any other kind of information. We don't have a limitation of something that has to be from a peer review journal article or has to be in a government database. There can be a whole range of different types of knowledge that's incorporated. It's not up to us in the Secretariat what kind of information is used and whether that information is valid. That's a process that's part of that's for the process to decide. That's for either the workshop or Substa and COP to decide if that information is sufficient. But I will say there's no limitations per se in the kinds of knowledge and information that can be incorporated and used in the process. I'm looking through any other things that come through. Somebody then said, well, somebody made a question, which I think speaks to something important, is how to engage with the process for area-based management tools, or MPAs, in the BBNJ agreement. So this is a very important point, actually. The BBNJ agreement, I think anybody probably following this webinar is at least familiar with the BBNJ agreement, the Agreement for Biodiversity in Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. And obviously an important focus of that process is area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. Now, the EBSA process is a completely separate process. We are a completely separate intergovernmental process from the BBNJ process. The BBNJ process and setting up ABMTs, designating ABMTs, what should be included, all the process for proposals, completely separate from our process. That's the BBNJ process. We're a CBD process. Now, it would certainly make sense, and it's very likely that much of the information, or quite a lot of the information that can be consolidated through the EBSA process can be very useful in the BBNJ process for looking at things such as area-based management tools, but also areas requiring impact assessment, for example. But that's up to that process and the parties to that process to use. This information is out there. And it can be used, and frankly should be used, for a whole range of different purposes, including the BBNJ process, but that is fully up to that process and to the parties involved in that process to do that. There is no formal linkage between CBD EBSA process and the BBNJ process. It's another form of information that's out there, probably very highly relevant to that process, I would say, and hopefully very informative for that process and under BBNJ, but there are no formal linkages for that process. So having something designated as an EBSA doesn't immediately mean it's going to be considered or dealt with in the BBNJ. It's another designation that can provide a good case for that, for example, but it doesn't have any formal linkages or implications in that regard. So I hope that was helpful. So then we have a question from our colleague at GFCM, and he's dealing with RFMOs. And I understand we're a little bit over time, so we're going to have to wrap up soon. He asked if RFMOs are formally consulted during the review of EBSA proposals and modifications, or is the consultation limited to states? Should RFMOs be informed directly by the Secretariat, or is it the responsibility of the proposing state to engage relevant RFMOs? It's a good question, and the role actually this issue was discussed a bit at the workshops that developed the final form of these, or at least the pre-final form of these modalities. There is no the comment period when submissions are open for comment. There's no limitation in terms of who can comment, and any state can comment, any relevant organization can comment, can provide input. And there's no designated, let's say, group of other entities that have to be formally consulted. So if something is out there, if something's open for comment, any intergovernmental, any state, any NGO, civil society organization, university, any intergovernmental organization, including RFMOs, can provide input on that. One of the reasons that 6-month period was put there was to actually accommodate the time it may take for intergovernmental organizations to consult with their respective members and parties on the need to potentially provide input in this regard. So we in the Secretariat wouldn't have the mandate to do any formal consultations with any intergovernmental organizations. We would probably do our best to make sure that when that notification is sent out, it also is sent out to the intergovernmental organizations that have competence, at least in that general area. But they would still have to respond through that same process of anybody giving submissions and input. I think that's enough for now. I got some positive expressions of support. So yeah, we're going to wrap it up now. I hope this was helpful. As I said, pretty much almost everything I've said is in the handbook that we've published a few weeks ago. And I encourage you to have a look at that handbook to get a better understanding of the process and to refer back to some of the things that I said before. But nonetheless, I hope this is helpful. There are, of course, these are new mechanisms, new modalities. So all of us, including us in the Secretariat, are going through a bit of a learning process, working through the speed bumps, actually seeing how this is exactly going to work in the process. Okay, so we actually had a very important question come in. I'm just gonna one more question, I promise, and then we will finish up. So the question is regarding workshops, and this is kind of an important issue. And the question is that if there are multiple proposals, will the workshops be held in the order in which the proposals are submitted, or depending on financial resources, will the workshop be held to review all proposals? So we have to look at workshops with a bit of practicality, right? Workshops are expensive. They cost more than 200,000 US dollars each, at least, if not more. Um, and they take a lot of time of the secretariat and everybody else involved. And we definitely will not have the ability to do workshops for all sets of proposals that come in. We won't be able to respond to any country saying, I want to have a workshop for my proposal or for my set of proposals. Let's have a workshop in this region. This is exactly the reason why we need to consult with the informal advisory group and with the Substa Bureau to decide where a workshop should be held. So what is likely going to happen is that once we get to a certain, probably some point in June or July, or maybe a little bit later, we'll look at all the submissions that we've received so far. We'll say, okay, where are these submissions located? And what do they look at? How big are they? How many are they? How many are areas within versus areas beyond national jurisdiction? Because remember, areas beyond national jurisdiction have to go through a workshop, whereas areas within national jurisdiction don't have to. And then make a decision based on those factors, including as well as resources available to decide where a workshop will be held and what the scope of that workshop would be. That's something we have to be advised on from the IAG. Now, I would hope in practice, I would hope that we could have at least 2 workshops per biennium, so maybe 1 workshop per year. But that depends on finances and money. And at the moment, we're lacking funds for that. I mean, the UN is in a big liquidity crisis right now. We know there's been some major financial happenings at the global level that I think are no secret to anybody that is limiting the availability of financial resources for all of these things. So it depends on those factors. And that's the thing. I think if somebody were to provide a submission now for areas beyond national jurisdiction, for example, well in advance and has all the information there, it's not guaranteed that that submission will be able to be considered by this Substa and by COP17. It depends on where the workshop is going to be held. And if the IAG and the Substa Bureau and the Secretariat advise, and on the basis of that advice, we don't hold a workshop for the region where that submission is located, we can't take that forward. So we have to work to see where we can hold the workshops on the basis of the submissions we've received, what they look at, what they address, how big they are, but we really have to be practical. We don't have the time or money to be running around doing 20 workshops a year for every submission that comes in. So this is no different than the previous process. The previous process, we held maybe two, maybe 3. I think at 3 was tough, but usually generally 1 to 2 workshops per biennium. So that's how we did it in the past, and that kind of dynamic will continue to be the case. We really don't want to be driven, and we shouldn't be driven by donor interests. So we shouldn't be driven by a given country saying, I want to have a workshop here, I'm going to pay for it, has to be here. This is also the point of why we were asked and mandated by the COP to consult with the IAG and the Bureau. So we're just not, dictated by where a given donor wants to have a workshop. But that's generally the dynamics that would go into how workshops will be selected and organized. So now I'm really going to wrap up, but thank you for that final question. That was a very important question and point to address. Thank you, Monica. I hope this was helpful. We will be doing another workshop, another webinar in about 11 hours from now. It will be the exact same, so you don't need to join if you followed here, but in case maybe perhaps you have colleagues in another part of the world who weren't able to attend this webinar, they could attend the other webinar and hear the same information. So I hope this was helpful again, and thank you so much for your interest and for participation, and look forward to seeing many of you and hopefully seeing some great submissions come in soon. So thank you, and with that we can end the webinar and I will say bye-bye. Thank you.